Okay, we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapters 3 and 4, and we're going to notice kind of the outcome of that war between Judah and the rest of Israel, between the forces of David and the forces of Ishbosheth. There's three main things that happen, kind of fairly rapid succession, to end the war in David's favor. There is more on this in some of the other Old Testament books, and as you read through, you may find duplicates. It's a little bit like, try to think of like the Gospels. You read something in Mark, and then you go read something in Luke, and it's very similar. The same thing is true about 1st and 2nd Samuel. Then you get into 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. A lot of the same things are described in those books. So you'll kind of reread and get extra information as you go through from different sources. But for tonight, I just want us to look at 2 Samuel chapters 3 and 4 and just look at kind of the reason why David eventually ended up being victorious in this civil war. The first one is that David was actually winning the battles. When your army is better organized, better fighters, whatever the reason, David's forces were winning. Look at chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. Now, a long time is relative. We've already seen that Ishbosheth's kingdom only lasted 2 years. So by the time David finishes his campaign against Ishbosheth and Israel comes over to the side of David, it wasn't like 10, 20 years. It was just 2 or 3 years. But it lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. So this by itself might eventually have been enough, but it didn't go on long enough for it to be just about the battles, just about David's forces being stronger or Ishbosheth's forces being weaker. I want us to notice kind of as we go through another little thing that's going on. If you are the winner, if you're the one who's on top in the Old Testament, typically your wives are doing better. And so we'll see that David is gaining more wives during this process. And also, they would have assumed that David is winning because God is on David's side. If your side is winning, then your God is stronger. Now, both of these men served the same God. David was a worshiper of Yahweh, and as far as I know, Ishbosheth was as well. Now, Saul had kind of gone off on his own and used his own priesthood, but his son Ishbosheth would have inherited the leadership of that wing of the Israelite priesthood. So I think that both men are still at least trying to worship the one true God. But since David is winning, people would have said, well, David must be closer to God, or God likes David better than he does Ishbosheth. But look at verse 2 down to verse 5. Sons were born to David at Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second, Chileab, the son of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, the son of David's wife Eglah. These were all born to David while he was in Hebron. So while the army's out there doing their thing, David's at home doing his. And there's a whole bunch of offspring being born to the women that David has married. Now again, David never comes close to Solomon. Solomon is a womanizer deluxe, and he ends up with 1,000 different women that are part of his entourage at some point. So, but David, his wives are doing well. Things are moving in the right direction for him. We'll see here in a minute how things are working for Ishbosheth on the other side. I got interested in this idea of both guys being servants to at least to a degree of the same God. And I started thinking about World War II. Right? In World War II, and perhaps even more so in World War I, there were European soldiers, American soldiers, probably would be the most, Great Britain, who were fighting against each other. At that point, Germany would have been predominantly Lutheran. A lot of the other nations around them would have been predominantly Catholic. North America was mainly Protestant with a lot of Catholic thrown in. The Church of England was dominant in Great Britain. So basically you have a lot of people who claimed the same God fighting against each other in World War I and in World War II. So that made me think, whose side was the Vatican on? Anybody history buff enough to know? The Vatican declared themselves neutral. They decided they weren't going to pick a dog in that fight, probably so that whichever side won, they'd be okay. The area around the Vatican, Rome, was conquered by both sides, originally conquered by Germany and Italy, and then later by the Allied forces when they came in, but nobody ever invaded or took over Vatican City. So everybody in that battle thought God was on their side. And we look back through history, and I think we too would claim whose side was God on? Well, he was on the side of the right ones. He was on the side of the Allies. He was on the side of America and Great Britain and Australia and all the others who fought on our side of the lines. So interestingly, I mean, people still have that same kind of attitude. You count who won and then decide who God likes better. Mark?
If I remember right on a little bit of the history, I know Adolf Hitler had his soldiers look for the Ark of the Covenant. He believed well enough that if he had the Ark of the Covenant with him, that he would be victorious, you know.
Yeah, they made a movie about that.
I never thought about that.
That's the whole premise of Raiders of the Lost Ark is if we've got the Ark, we win, right? So, and people are still looking. Don't think that anybody has stopped looking. They think that maybe the Ark of the Covenant is somewhere still in Jerusalem. Some people think that it is in Ethiopia. Some people think that it has a special hiding place somewhere else in the Middle East. And of course, there's a box in the Smithsonian somewhere back in the very back of beyond that actually has the real Ark in it. We don't know. But if the Jewish nationals, if the Israeli government thought they could actually get it back, wouldn't you want it? I mean, and to some, it's just an archaeological piece. But to some, it carries that idea. If you've got the Ark, you've got God, and if you've got God, then you win. At this point in history, the Ark existed. They knew where the Ark was. Neither side goes to get it. Right? David and his men don't go to Kiriath Jearim to get it. Ishbosheth and his forces, they don't go to Kiriath Jearim to go get the Ark. It's odd. But both were following, as we know it, the same God and getting very different results. The second thing that happens is that there is a change in the leadership of the armies that is caused by a rift, a little mini war that goes on between Ishbosheth and his general Abner. Now I've already told you, I like Abner. Abner's an honorable guy. We saw him actually end up killing, which one was it? Abishai, right? Either Abishai or Asahel. One of the three brothers was chasing him and wouldn't leave him alone, and he thrust backwards, kept trying to get the kid to leave him alone, he never would, and he ends up killing him. But Abner is the chief of all the armies for Ishbosheth. Abner is the reason that Ishbosheth is king over Israel. When Saul died, Abner stepped in, appoints the next king, he gets Israel to back him. Abner's the whole reason that Ishbosheth is in power anyway. But Saul had a concubine named Rizpah. And I don't know whether Abner actually took Rizpah for his own or whether Ishbosheth just thought he did. But let's read, starting in verse 6. During the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner had been strengthening his own position in the house of Saul. Now Saul had had a concubine named Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" Now, if Abner did, it fits in with this statement that he was trying to strengthen his standing. If you sleep with the king's concubine, then that means that you're of a higher ranking. When David's son rises up against David, he takes all of David's concubines up on the roof of the palace to make sure that anybody that can see him up there sees that he has possession of the harem. Right? He wants people to know that he has taken his father's concubine. So maybe Abner does take this woman Rizpah for his, but in his mind, it shouldn't be a question. Ishbosheth should be just as happy for him to have Rizpah. There shouldn't be any problem with this. However, Ishbosheth challenges him on it, embarrasses him basically publicly, and Abner decides that he's had enough of Ishbosheth. He's going to trade sides and go to work for David. What happens if the strongest general in Ishbosheth's army goes over to David? Ishbosheth's done. Yeah. He knows everything. He knows everything about the army. He knows every weakness. He knows everything that he would have to know to end that war quickly. So Ishbosheth should not have spoken against him. At least it works out that way. Look down at verse, let's start at 9. May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath, and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul, and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba. Dan to Beersheba is as big as it ever gets. When Solomon is the king, he rules from Dan to Beersheba. Dan is in the very north. Beersheba is way down in the south toward Egypt. That's as big as Israel ever got. So you've got a promise from Abner to Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth would not dare say another word to Abner because he was afraid of Abner. So Abner checks in with David, makes sure that he would be welcome. I'm not sure why he would ever think that he wouldn't be. David and Abner have known each other for years and years, and David knows what an asset he would be. Abner comes to visit. David throws a big feast for him. But before he will allow Abner to come in the door, he makes him do one more thing. He says, I want you to bring Michal, my wife, when you come. Is Michal still David's wife? We could talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage all night if we want to, but Saul married her to David. When David went on the lam, he took her away from David and married her off to another man. So she was a political pawn. Her daddy used her to solidify relationships with different people. How did David get Michal in the first place? Killing 100 Philistines, right? His father-in-law says, if you'll bring me the foreskins of 100 Philistines, I'll give her to you for a wife. David and his men go out and they bring 200. So he purchases her by killing 200 Philistines. When Michal and David are separated, it's not because Michal and David make that decision. We see some signs that Michal really loves David. We see some signs that David really loves Michal. But look down at verse 15. Abner doesn't actually have the power himself to give Michal back to David. So Ishbosheth gave orders and had her taken away from her husband Paltiel, the son of Laish. Her husband, however, went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, go back home. So he went back home. Somebody loved Michal besides David. He loved her so much that he followed and he cried and he begged her to come back home. She wasn't at her own whim. She wasn't at her own fancy, right? She was under the orders of her father's son. I don't know if they were natural brother and sister, but at least her half-brother was in charge of the nation. And he said, you're no longer going to be married to this guy. Now we're going to give you back to David. Why would Ishbosheth do that? Ishbosheth was weak. He didn't really run his nation. Abner ran his nation. And when he crossed Abner, Abner says, I'm going over to David. Everybody in David's camp, for the most part, accepted Abner, and they threw a banquet. They honored him. David said, glad to have you. You can go in peace. So now David has Michal back, and Abner has a new connection with the south rather than with the north. However, not every vote was taken. And when Abner leaves David's presence, the two brothers of the young man who died came back from a raid that they had been on. Look over at chapter 3, verse 22. 3:22. Just then David's men and Joab returned from a raid and brought with them a great deal of plunder. But Abner was no longer with David in Hebron, because David had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the soldiers with him arrived, he was told that Abner, son of Ner, had come to the king, and that the king had sent him away, and that he had gone in peace. So Joab went to the king and said, what have you done? Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he is gone. You know that Abner, son of Ner, he came to deceive you and observe your movements, find out everything you are doing. So Joab leaves David's side. He goes, he catches up with Abner, and he kills him. So instead of having the greatest asset in the history of assets come over to the southern army, come over to David and his men, Joab kills him. But Joab is getting revenge for the death of his brother. He and his brother are accounted together as the ones who murdered Abner. So you've got lots of things that are going on kind of underneath that are changing the whole complexity of the thing. The second of the murders that takes place is done by Rechab and Baanah. Okay, look over at chapter 4 and verse 9. By the way, the rest of chapter 3, you remember all the mourning that David did when Saul and Jonathan died? Abner gets the same kind of funeral. Even if you were politically opposed to David, if you had fought against each other tooth and nail, he would honor you if you were an honorable man, and Abner was an honorable man. Let me give you just here's the lament that David wrote for him. You remember the lament that he wrote for Saul and Jonathan and made everybody learn how to sing it? This is the lament that he wrote for Abner. Should Abner have died as the lawless die? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. You fell as one falls before the wicked. All the people wept over Abner. So he was an honorable guy doing an honorable thing, but Joab was so bent on revenge that he ruined something that might otherwise have been a wonderful thing. All right, chapter 4, beginning in verse 9, we find out what happens, that David is still David even after all of this. Saul is dead, Jonathan's dead, Ishbosheth is the king. These two men go to Ishbosheth's residence, the heat of the day, when he's taking his afternoon nap, and they stab him to death. They are proud of what they've done. You remember the Amalekite who helped Saul die? Saul's in the throes of death. The Philistines are coming. Don't let me fall into the Philistines' hand. Finish me off. He does, and then he travels all the way to David to make sure that David knows that they've killed, or that he has finished off his opponent. Brings him the crown, brings him the bracelet, so David will have those. These two men, Rechab and Baanah, these brothers, kill Ishbosheth, and then they go down south to make sure that David knows that the opponent in the civil war, the other king, has been killed. So look at beginning in verse 9. David answered Rechab and his brother Baanah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, when someone told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That's the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed? Why should I now not demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you?" Think about how fair-minded David is here. What had Ishbosheth done to David? Nothing personally. Right? Abner took him. He was Saul's son. It was just understood that your son would take over the kingdom. So Jonathan's dead. He gets Ishbosheth, sets him up in the kingdom, and is his backer, his supporter. And as far as David is concerned, he's an opponent, he's an enemy, but he is a duly appointed king of Israel. And we know what David does to folks when they kill the duly appointed king of Israel. Verse 12, David gave an order to his men, and they killed them. They cut off their hands and their feet and hung the bodies by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron. Forgot to tell you that part. The brothers brought the head with them just to make sure that he knew that the guy was really dead. Life was tough in those days. And these were hard men doing things that they thought were the right thing to do. Some of them got it right, some of them didn't. David is God's man, and God has already anointed him. Now, starting next week, Lord willing, we'll look at David as king over the whole thing. He'll finally be anointed by the people. But it's been 20 years since David was anointed king by God. He finally is coming into what God has already promised him. Saul knew it. Jonathan knew it. Abner knew it. Ishbosheth evidently knew it, but I don't think Abner was telling him anything new. Everything has been moving in one direction for all these years until the young man David was ready to sit on the throne of a unified Israel. It will be the first time that we have a suitable king in the right place at the right time over all of Israel. Saul was there, but he was kind of a building block. He didn't really ever completely control Israel as he might have. He was a weak guy, wasn't as strong as David would be. And then, of course, Ishbosheth was just a weak man, didn't get much done. But David will finally really establish the kingdom of Israel. And by the time his son Solomon takes over as king, it will be one of the greatest kingdoms of that era. Solomon will have peace. He will be surrounded by wealth. Lots of things that David's going to do in the next few years as king are going to be long-lasting things. Unfortunately, the people that follow him as king will not be quite the man that David himself was. But, Lord willing, beginning next week, we'll take a look at chapter 5 and talk about David as king over the whole thing. Any questions or thoughts? None? Okay. Tell you guys bye.